Hello and welcome to Motorsport Speak, a weekly motorsport podcast brought to you by the team behind Motorsport Week and motorsportmonday.com. My name's Dan Lawrence and I'm joined by Motorsport Week and Motorsport Monday editor Taylor Powling, and we're here to discuss the Formula One Japanese Grand Prix, where normal service resumed after Ferrari's 1-2 finish in Australia. The Dutchman striked back in a springtime edition of the Japanese Grand Prix, leading a comfortable Red Bull 1-2. There were plenty of other shenanigans going on behind the two Red Bulls where the race was a bit more interesting. But Taylor, how are you and did you enjoy the race?
Hi Dan, I'm good, thanks. I hope you're good as well. By Japan standards of recent years, especially in the dry, it wasn't a bad race. I mean, you look at the results, you see Verstappen win, Perez second, Red Bull 1-2, same old. But the tyres this weekend and the degradation and the allocations that each team had available actually did spice it up, and it was really interesting, to watch that play out, especially when you had Leclerc and Ferrari trying to execute a one-stop strategy against the two of other teams. But yeah, there are lots of overtakes, a bit of action at the end with Russell and Piastri, so I say a solid 7 out of 10.
A Formula One 7 out of 10 of the current generation, would you say?
Yeah, not a 7 out of 10 in kind of general standards, more of what we've become accustomed to over the last few years with the ground effect cars.
We've been beaten in submission to giving this a 7 out of 10. I must admit, it was refreshing to have it as a springtime race. There was obviously the rain interference for the second practice session on Friday, which ended up just because of the tyre allocation, nobody bothered going out pretty much until the very end, which was a bit of a shame for people watching, people reporting, people live at the track. But to have a drive, to sort of not have the threat of rain and to have a dry race, because obviously another problem with this current generation of cars is as soon as it's wet, it's just a nightmare. And we've had that problem at Suzuka already. So a dry race was good. I'd say by Formula One standards, I kind of enjoyed it, to be honest. Once you just resign yourself to the fact that obviously Red Bull are going to win, and it looked pretty nailed on that Perez was going to finish second quite early on, I thought. And I guess we should touch on that later because I think he had quite a solid race. I think particularly Ferrari, their strategy mechanisms, the way they manage their race to sort of progress into their third and fourth finishing positions, I thought was really interesting. But should we touch on Max Verstappen and Red Bull quickly and sort of what this means going forward? I think it's kind of a foregone conclusion what it means going forward. But yeah, what did you make of their comfortable 1-2 victory?
I mean, Australia was kind of a false dawn in the sense that we all kind of, looked on Suzuka as being the ideal Red Bull track. It tests the efficiency of a car, and there's no more efficient car than the Red Bull RB20, and Verstappen yielded that to expert effect. I mean, I think qualifying, he didn't quite get the most out of it. I think that did flatter the competition. So when you had Mercedes saying, oh, well, we've halved the gap from last year in terms of qualifying pace, I think Verstappen had a few tenths in his pocket. You saw on that last lap, it wasn't quite perfect. He didn't improve in his middle sector. So, yeah, I think Verstappen, he'd have been kicking himself if he didn't get pole position, but I don't think it would have made a difference anyway because he had the pace over Perez. Perez's race was hampered with, he said that in the first stint, the balance of his car was off due to the increase in temperature. It had been quite cool all weekend, but come race day, it went up to 40 degrees, the track, which I think caught a lot of teams out potentially. Verstappen had to change or tweak his front wing at the red flag because he was struggling with understeer, then oversteer. So, yeah, it wasn't all plain sailing in the Red Bull camp, but plain sailing enough that they had the edge over the competition to deliver a third 1-2 finish in 4 races.
Yes, I think there was a lot of talk, wasn't there, in Australia about if Verstappen hadn't have retired, maybe they could have challenged each other, like it could have been a close fight for the victory. But I feel like even though the Ferrari was a stronger package in Australia and there was a bit more of an equalisation because of the nature of the circuit, I still think I think Suzuka's evidence that Verstappen would have won in Australia had he been able to finish the race, because him and Red Bull seem to be able to overcome any little obstacles that sort of come their way. And obviously the ones at Suzuka were minimal. Obviously you say like the temperature increase and stuff like that. I think if it had been cooler, probably would we say that the margin for victory probably would have been even bigger?
Red Bull actually think that the hot temperatures helped them because obviously they're the benchmark in tyre degradation. They have been since 2022, really. Ferrari dispute that a little bit. I think both Sainz and team principal Fred Vasseur said that we'll only get evidence of that when we go to Shanghai next time out because China is typically a cooler race. So yeah, I think regardless of the conditions, Red Bull had this one on lock, and it was really a battle for second best.
Yes, or third best even really if we're talking drivers, because Sergio Perez, he sort of dialed out he bounced back, let's say, because he had, I mean, it was an underwhelming race in Australia, but more importantly, Suzuka last year was an absolute howler for him. He had 2 retirements, which was an interesting achievement. It was just difficult for him last time out at Suzuka, whereas here he qualified well. Obviously, it was 0.66 seconds, I think, shy of Verstappen's pole time, and that's been one of his issues throughout sort of last season, especially. He did these poor qualifying performances and he had to fight his way back through positions, whereas here, lining up on the front row, he was able to sort of he had a bit more control over his destiny and calmly took second in the end. He had to, obviously, with the way the pit stops and strategy played out, he did have some overtaking to do, but he pulled off all those manoeuvres. And Horner dropped that wonderful quote because he put those 2 moves on the inside of 130R on the 2 Mercedes. He said Perez didn't look like a man who had 3 kids. So, yeah, a nice punchy drive from Perez there. What did you make of his performance?
As you said, it was the perfect response because I think Suzuka was obviously his slump last season kind of carried on into Qatar, but I think Japan was the low point. You said qualified 8/10 off pole and then was effectively retired twice due to damage. Yeah, Verstappen, I think, had time in hand in qualifying, so that 0.066 gap maybe not representative, but that doesn't take anything away from Perez because he did the job, and to be that close to Verstappen on a driver's circuit is a testament to how strong he was this weekend. And in the race, other times he might have cracked under that pressure having to come through the field, but he executed his moves when he had to. And yeah, just an assured drive, and again, I think it's a testament to why Red Bull kept him and why he got brought on board is because drivers like Albon and Gasly before him, when the going got tough, they buckled. Whereas Perez, with his experience in F1, he's rebounded from last year, and he started the year doing what Red Bull need him to do. He's finished second 3 times in 4 races, and he arguably would have been on the podium in Australia if it wasn't for an impeding incident, which you can probably put the blame on Red Bull for that, for his engineer not informing him that Hulkenberg was on a push lap.
Yeah. I think also, he seems to be settling into his number 2 role a lot better now. He seems to have, there's not been any talk from him about like title challenges or any of that sort of, I think he kind of mentioned that in like the post-season Abu Dhabi test last season, and obviously he mentioned it at the front end of the 2023 campaign. He seems to really have settled into his number 2 role. One thing I found really funny is when he was asked about those moves at 130R on the 2 Mercedes in the press conference after the race, he said, and I quote, "Spending time around one of the slowest cars, given the degradation they were having, it was quite penalising, so I was going for it." Quite an indictment of Mercedes, and I think we should touch on that a bit later when we get onto Mercedes. But first, let's talk about Ferrari. There seems to be I mean, obviously they were a step behind Red Bull today, and they've got work to do to catch up, and they're talking about hopefully upgrades will bring them on sort of. They said after, I think Sainz said, the first third of the season, expect the gaps to be like this, but then they're hoping upgrades will bring them closer, but we don't know. Red Bull probably will bolt on a bunch of upgrades at the same time and the gap will stay the same. But anyway, Ferrari have done everything they wanted to do over the winter. They seem to have a more drivable car. The car it's putting them in a really good window strategy-wise because they can just manage tyre life really well. And we saw that with Leclerc going from 8th to 4th, executing that one stop with that sort of mega first stint on the medium compound. And Sainz was able to do that positive offset for his last stint on the hard tyres. I think he had like 10 laps in hand on all of the competitors in front of him, so he was able to just calmly pick his way back pitted from the lead, came out 7th, calmly went through to 3rd at the end. Seems to be a very different Ferrari compared to the team we've seen in the past few years. This is having a good effect, but so yeah, quite not as euphoric as a 1-2 in Australia, but I was sort of pleasantly, not surprised, but enthused by their performance at Suzuka. How would you measure their performance?
It is so refreshing, even from a neutral standpoint, to wake up for a race and you can see Ferrari making progress. Because I'd argue since 2017, they've not had a car that's good on its tyres, that can match qualifying pace with race pace or even improve upon that. But the end result is they're getting the race results now. They're still not getting the qualifying results now. That's something they do need to work on. Touching on it in a bit, Charles Leclerc, another disappointing qualifying. He said that he needs to get to the bottom. He thinks it's to do with the outlaps, how he's preparing the tyres in the outlap, because the problem he had in Suzuka was that his tyres were either undercooked for the first sector, but then when he tried to, bring them up to temperature more for that first sector, in the last sector, they were then overheating, and that's where he lost all his time and he dropped to 8th on the grid. So if they can get on top of that, because Red Bull were worried about Leclerc's race pace. Helmut Marko even said they were relieved that he started 8th, and I think if he'd have started 3rd or 4th, where you could argue the potential of the car should have been, I reckon he could have challenged Perez potentially. His race pace was that good. His degradation was brilliant. He had the lowest degradation in the field. I saw a graph after the race. The way he managed that one stop kind of puts to bed that he's not good in race trim, or he can't manage. This is an argument that I've seen for so many years, and I think it's one that's just complete nonsense and just one of those things that when a narrative is formed, people just bang that same rhetoric, because you can go back to 2020 when Ferrari had that awful SF1000 car. Leclerc did a one-stop, I think it was the 70th anniversary Grand Prix. I think it was that one where the Pirelli went softer on the tyres, and it was a complete nightmare. Mercedes had blistering throughout the race, like 4 laps into a stint. Leclerc managed a one-stop to get 4th, I think, in that race. So I don't see... It's kind of a shame that Ferrari building cars that, are rapid over 1 lap but don't have that degradation under control has created this narrative that Leclerc's weaker in race trim, because he always has been a very good peddler in the races, and I think he's kind of got frustrated with that narrative building, because he did say post race that I've always been competent in race, I've just not had the car to show it. And now both him and Sainz have got that car. As he said, it's more compliant, it's more benign, and it opens up so many strategical options. And I think Suzuka, with its being a high degradation surface, was the ultimate confirmation of how far Ferrari have come, because you had one driver who, out of position, had to take a few risks on the strategy, do a one-stop to get up into 4th, and then you had the other one who was able then to go long to then bring it back later on to get 3rd. So they've actually got variety now. They're not kind of resigning themselves to, we've qualified well, but we know we're going to drop back. We're going to have to make earlier stops than the rest, because we're struggling with degradation. They've got those options now, and as Leclerc's pointed out as well, they're maximising races. I think you can only say Leclerc's brake issue in Bahrain, which probably prevented him from finishing 2nd in that race. That's the only points left on the table. To get 3rd and 4th at one of their weaker tracks, Suzuka's not really historically been a strong Ferrari track in recent years. It shows how far they've come, both from a car point of view with their high-speed performance, their degradation, and also operationally. They're kind of firing on all cylinders now, and if they can get those upgrades on, if they're a big step forward, hopefully when there are more front-limited circuits like Melbourne, we can see Ferrari really taking the challenge to Red Bull.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a sort of a feeling that we're not going to see just the one non-Red Bull win this year. I feel like Australia kind of proved, there was the DNF and maybe Verstappen would have won, but it showed that Ferrari on their day can be really close. And because they're executing so well, I have more faith in them that when they are there on a par with Red Bull or close to it, they will realistically be able to challenge in those circumstances. Also, just touching on what you said about Leclerc, the 2020 and 2021 Ferraris were not good cars, and he put in some stunning performances. He was getting the 2020 car on the podium, which was quite remarkable because that thing was genuinely awful. And he was leading the British Grand Prix in 2021 for the majority of the race. So, yeah, I agree with you. There's a lot of sort of unfair sort of labels that are put on Leclerc. I really hope that he can get on top of his qualifying form before Monaco, because if he can get qualifying sorted, put it on pole on Monaco, Ferrari are running like a more well-oiled machine, then maybe he'll finally end his curse at home circuit. And I think that could be... I would forgive the 2024 season for pretty much everything if Leclerc can win at Monaco this year. So, yes, things are looking good for Ferrari. And if we're talking about strategy and sort of the way strategy is executed, Ferrari doing those things very well. A team that perhaps wasn't doing those things well was McLaren. We had Lando Norris lined up on the grid in third. Coming into the weekend, I think they were quietly confident because they had a double podium at Suzuka last year. Ever since they updated their car last year, they've been good in the high-speed corners, so Suzuka is a circuit that suits them. So yeah, Norris put in a good qualifying performance, third behind the Red Bulls, but then slipped back in the race. And I think McLaren probably playing things a bit too cautious and got potentially caught out by Ferrari en route to slipping to fifth, especially with the sort of managing Leclerc on the one stop, pitting at the same time as McLaren. McLaren sort of then just strategized themselves into a position where they were going to finish behind. What did you make of their race?
Yeah, I think if you recall when we did our post-Australia podcast, I mentioned that McLaren strategy decisions this season have all the hallmarks of a team that is immature and learning to be a top team again. We've seen Ferrari kind of, obviously they had their slump to the midfield, as you said, 2020 and 2021. And then 2022, we saw a plethora of strategy mistakes. And it feels like although McLaren aren't in that same competitive position of fighting for wins and the mistakes aren't high profile, they're not costing them like huge results, I think it is similar. And there is comparisons there because I think Sainz would have been a tall order for Norris to beat. McLaren, they struggled with degradation quite a lot. I mean, you saw it in the first stint. Norris was struggling and Sainz was all over the rear, and that kind of prompted their earlier pit stop. Piastri, for all the steps he's made on degradation and race management this year, he really struggled compared to Norris. And that was the same 6 months ago at Suzuka. But I think Norris could have easily split the Ferraris again. It was a strange one because I kind of got, once it was obvious that Leclerc was angling for that one stop, going for an undercut kind of made sense to get track position. But then the minute that they kind of saw the Ferrari crew getting ready and Leclerc coming in, I think Norris should have stayed out because unless you're quick in the pits and Ferrari are up there with Red Bull now as the quickest and the slickest in the pit lane, you're kind of then snookering yourself to finish behind him because you've got to make an on-track pass sick. And McLaren are aware that their car's not as strong as Ferrari's. They've admitted it, that the Ferrari car's better. They expect to finish behind Ferrari in race trim. If that's the case, why would you give up track position and fight a losing battle when you've not got an offset on tyres at all? And also made him come out behind George Russell, which then that took him out of DRS range of Leclerc, and Leclerc just managed the gap because they were both on 30 lap stints then, or 27 lap stints to the end. So yeah, really question. And then another thing is, I know you don't want to ruin Piastri's race, but Leclerc and Norris were coming up towards Piastri, and I was fully expecting them to leave Piastri out as kind of like a robot, because at least then Norris could have got into DRS at that point, and it might have been a different race. You could have at least applied some pressure to the Ferrari, but then they kind of left him out a little bit, and before Leclerc got onto his tail, they pitted him. So Yeah, for all the progress McLaren have made with their car, strategically they are still lacking, even compared to Ferrari. And then if you've got aspirations of beating Red Bull, you've got another step on kind of your operational side to go.
Yeah. Also, quick side note with McLaren, they've obviously had their technical structure changed up a bit as well. With David Sanchez, who's only been there since January, already departing the team. He was one of the three-pronged technical director structure, and ahead of the Japanese Grand Prix, they announced he's parting ways, and there's been another rejig of all the staff there. And I think it Sanchez's seller. They said the role that he thought he was getting didn't end up being the role he had, which to me just sounds like maybe too many, the too many cooks in the kitchen sort of scenario. Quickly before we move on to other teams in the race, is that a concerning sign that they've waited a whole year of gardening leave to get an engineer of Sanchez's caliber into the team? He's turned up, probably gone like, oh, there's not really much for me to do here, and left after not really doing anything.
Yeah, I think it'll kind of get swept under the carpet because it's not going to affect McLaren in the short term. But these type of, it's like anything in F1, something that happens now, you won't see the benefits or the disadvantages until months or even a year down the line. There's always that kind of lag period. It's a confusing one because McLaren put so much emphasis on this new three-pronged structure and, having it in place, and this is what's going to take them to that next step. And one of the, leading pillars of that has departed, as you say, within 3 months. I'd put blame on, obviously, from the outside, you can't, establish who's at fault. But from my point of view, I think both are to blame in some ways. It just seems like a lack of communication over what Sanchez thought, how much responsibility Sanchez thought he would have, and McLaren, informing him what he'd be doing. I just feel there's like that divide there. But yeah, I think it is a concern, especially when it's the middle of the season and you've now got Andrea Stella, team principal, taking on one of those technical roles on an interim basis, which is the right call because you don't want to obviously rush into a decision. You want to find the right replacement, not someone that's going to come in short term for 3 months and then be off again. But yeah, it's not when you're a team on an upward trajectory, you're not gonna want this minor setback, even if it is very minor and doesn't interrupt your on-track progress.
Anyway, back to the racing. Behind Lando Norris was Fernando Alonso in sixth. After his tactics at Australia, he decided to give some more tactics a go because he found himself under pressure in the closing laps. There was a sort of a charging George Russell in a way, if you can call the Mercedes charging, behind Oscar Piastri, and Alonso was backing off a bit to give Piastri DRS so that Russell couldn't get through and take both of their places. Yeah, Alonso had a fine qualifying performance again, 5th place, firmly entrenched in Q3, and he seemed very, very happy with that performance, and he was a bit more cautious. He didn't really know where they'd end up in the race because obviously their race pace doesn't seem to be as good, but he held on, only lost that one position, obviously Leclerc being the one that sort of displaced him with his charge through. So yeah, all seems to be going well in Alonso's side of the garage, but it was a very, very different story for Lance Stroll. Failed to get out of Q1, which isn't great, to say the least. He was sort of struggling to find out, what went wrong for him. He got the upgrades as well on Friday, and Alonso only got them on Saturday, if I'm correct, to the AMR 24. Mike Crack as well, after qualifying, said it was bittersweet. We want to get both cars into Q3, but somehow we didn't. So we need to understand what went wrong on Stroll's car, which obviously invited a lot of people speculating that maybe it's the person behind the wheel. Stroll did have a sort of a better race, managed to sort of fight through, and he was dancing on the fringes of the points. He did have that rather alarming radio message where he complained about the lack of straight line speed in the Aston Martin. I don't know if you heard that. It was high-pitched, exasperated, and a bit dramatic. So yeah, a tale of two halves for Aston Martin. good in the Alonso camp, not so good in the Stroll camp.
Yeah, some things don't change in F1 in many respects, not just Red Bull's dominance. Alonso placed this weekend within his top 5 F1 weekends ever, but I think Alonso probably has about 100 to 150 weekends in his top 5. He said it that often, so take it with a pinch of salt. But yeah, like on a serious note, his weekend was really good. Qualifying performance after the first runs in Q3, he didn't think he could find any more time, yet there he went, put it in the top 5. And losing the position to Leclerc, he only actually lost it because Leclerc crafted a strategy on his own thinking that kind of elevated him ahead of all those cars he qualified behind. To beat both Mercedes and the McLaren, you can't really ask for anything more from Alonso. But on the same token, in regards to his future, he finished 44 seconds off the lead. So while Aston Martin have made a sizable improvement compared to where they were at Suzuka 6 months ago, they're still quite far from where they were at the start of last season. And also, like, just in general, from catching up to Red Bull. And Alonso was asked about his future, and although he kind of ruled out a move to Mercedes because at this point in time it would be a step backwards, I think he's now, with the 24 race calendar and how much commitment you have to give to F1, he's operating on a even more limited time span for how long he wants to remain in the sport. And he wants to spend his final years, with the knowledge that he can fight for wins and titles. And although Aston might have a lot of promise, that doesn't always translate to potential, and he needs to start seeing it on the car. They brought some of their upgrades forward this weekend. I think they were scheduled for Imola, and they managed to accelerate them. I think that's part of a ploy to, keep Alonso happy because, as he said, Aston Martin are the 5th fastest team. He thinks they're kind of in no man's land and kind of thinks his exploits are the reason he's able to haul it up to a 6th place finish. The problem Aston Martin have got, although their tyre degradation was much improved this weekend, that was one concern that they've had. If this is a big part of their Imola upgrade already, and they're still kind of, teetering quite far behind McLaren and Ferrari, once McLaren bring their upgrade in Miami and Ferrari bring their upgrade in Imola, how much are Aston Martin going to slip back? And then you would suspect as a matter of time Mercedes get their act together, judging by Toto Wolff's, comments, but on previous evidence, you can't really bank on Mercedes to deliver on promises. As for Stroll, his strategy in the race wasn't the best. He kind of, I don't really know what Aston Martin were doing. It kind of went under the radar a bit, but they angled for, they kind of just got him snookered within the midfield. They kind of just followed instead of, maximise the potential of the car and the pace advantage and either going long or undercutting, I think they ran a longer first stint and then ran a really, really short middle stint, which didn't really make too much sense because you don't get the best of either world. You don't get an undercut to start with, and then you don't get the overcut at the end. So, yeah, but it's his own fault for getting knocked out in Q1 on pure pace, and I will keep saying it. Lance Stroll, what you see is what you get. He's young, but we've had enough evidence now since he came into F1 to know that he's not going to get much better than this. And Aston Martin, a team with aspirations of winning a title, if Stroll wasn't the son of the team's owner, his performances wouldn't have kept him in that seat. And their potential is always going to be limited by him in that second seat. I think if you are serious about your ambitions to, compete with the likes of Red Bull, you want to have an Alonso type driver. And then when someone like Seitz is on the market, or Tsunoda, might be looking for a way out of the Red Bull program, I think you've got to take that sort of gamble.
Yeah, I agree with you. He's definitely sort of holding the team back. If you look at Aston Martin, a point behind Mercedes, Alonso has 24 of Aston Martin's 33 points. So Stroll's only got 9. If he'd qualified better, he probably would have. He would have at least got 1 point, probably. I don't think Honda are going to want to let that fly. I think they're going to be a works team in 2026. They need to have a strong pairing. Yeah. And as you say with the upgrades, you're bringing upgrades forward, but then it's not sort of doing anything for you. Then 20 races to go, that might have been a misstep. Yeah, I think Aston Martin destined to be sort of 4th, 5th best team, depending on what Mercedes can do for the rest of the year. And yeah, there's a lot of potential there, but they are being held back. They've sort of got one arm tied behind their back with their driver selection tactics. Should we talk about Mercedes?
Yes.
Wasn't a great day at the office for them. Another, should we say, underwhelming performance? I'm not even sure if you can label it as that. I think it's an expected performance. They're quite clearly struggling. George Russell had a more sort of a better final stint, being able to sort of pressure the likes of Piastri and Alonso, and eventually split those two to finish 7th. Hamilton was sort of in the doldrums in 9th and generally not having a very good time. They didn't look like they had the pace on a hard tyre in the middle stint. It was a woeful middle stint for them, to be honest. They were just going backwards. And Hamilton came on the radio and he was like, we need to change the strategy. Toto Wolff, after the race, obviously was quite dismissive of their performance. Not a lot of positives coming out of the Mercedes camp, and not a lot of sort of good prospects for them going forward either.
No, it seems to be after each underwhelming Mercedes performance, you get a new soundbite from Toto Wolff explaining what their latest problem is. So we've obviously had before, after Saudi Arabia, he mentioned there was a fundamental correlation problem between what the wind tunnel figures were saying and the on-track performance, particularly through high-speed corners. He has now revealed, following the Japanese Grand Prix, that the Mercedes W15 has, in certain corners, and he used Melbourne 2 weeks ago as an example of this, a certain corner at Melbourne, didn't say which one, the car is, on the simulations, is displaying, or on the data suggesting they have 70 points more downforce than the W14. However, while they can see that downforce, it's not translating to lap time, not even a kilometre per hour, he said. So they've got this downforce, they can see it's there, but it's not doing anything. And for those who, maybe newer fans or whatnot, 70 points of downforce is quite a lot. Quite a seismic difference lap time wise. So, yeah, I mean, it's not good. I mean, they've had pods before where they've had data saying, like with the zero pod in 2022, the data was telling them they should have so much downforce. And
only 90 points, wasn't it? They took out of that one. Wasn't that what Hamilton said? 90 points out of that one?
Hamilton said in Australia, 2022, they had 90 points of downforce. They had to temper or basically remove because to temper the bouncing, the porpoising they were experiencing. This is a slightly different case because the downforce is there. It's just not translating to lap time, and they don't know why, which is quite concerning because if you've got, Mercedes at the moment they're teetering on the edge of being the 5th fastest team. They're only 1 point ahead of Aston Martin. Without Alonso's penalty in Australia, that was quite highly spoke about in the run-up to the Japanese Grand Prix. Mercedes will be 5th right now. Hamilton scored, I think, 9 points in the first 4 races, which is his worst start to a season ever now. I think even using the old point system, it's his worst ever start. So, yeah, not good for Mercedes. Wolff did put a positive spin on it. He said they treated it as an experimental race, which I wouldn't take the positives from experimenting 3 years into this regulation cycle when you only got another year and then the new race in 2026. But he said they learned a lot of things from the race, and that actually their pace wasn't too bad. When you compare it to Suzuka last year, through the high-speed sweeps in Sector 1, they weren't losing as much time. And without that atrocious first stint where they had no pace on the hards because they attempted to do effectively a one-stop strategy after the restart. They got rid of the mediums, put on the hards, and were hoping to do a one-stop onto hards, but they didn't have the pace in their first in and then had to abandon it. Without that, Wolf thinks they had podium potential pace, which, yeah, remains to be seen whether that's the case. I highly doubt that Mercedes, without that difficult first stint, could have been in contention with Ferrari and McLaren, and it's more of a case of Wolf trying to gaslight people into, not talking about Mercedes struggles so much and putting a positive spin on things.
Yeah, I mean, if he thinks they had podium potential, he must be looking at similar simulations that say that they've got, like all this downforce that just sort of seems to, when it comes to an actual race weekend, decides to go on holiday or whatever. It always comes to like what are these simulation tools that they're using? Like, is it a case of like Lotus in 93 and 94 where they're just like taping bits of string to the car and like flying it around an airfield? Like, I honestly, it's for a team that built cars like the W10, it's quite perplexing, the state that they're in. And I would say, yeah, they definitely probably were the fifth fastest car in Suzuka. And I think, didn't Wolf also mention sort of McLaren's progress is, they've mentioned that before, I think they mentioned that last year, but McLaren's progress is sort of like a sign of encouragement for Mercedes because it's proof you can turn things around. But if that's the case, I mean, McLaren knew exactly what was wrong with their car when they started the 2023 season, and they knew exactly how to change it, and they literally told everyone, when you see the upgraded spec of car, we will be quicker, and, they were. Whereas Mercedes, they keep saying these things, like when we get to Yas Marina at the end of the season, going like, wait and see what we're doing next year, and it almost feels like they're going backwards. Obviously, they're not, like their cars are progressing, but relative to everyone else, yeah.
The worrying thing as well is that the one man who, Hamilton, fair enough, we've seen he can be quite, pessimistic and downbeat at the best of times. But he's the only one that seems to be putting Mercedes struggles into perspective and actually being realistic about the situation, because George Russell, he kind of, sings from the same hymn sheet as Toto Wolff about positivity, and you mentioned it as well. Abu Dhabi last year, they kind of, they were really defiant in the press conference, saying, we know what's wrong with the car, new car concept, clean slate, we're going to hit the ground running again. And it's, if anything, they've gone backwards relatively, and losing Hamilton, it looks likely that they're going to be putting a rookie Antonelli in that seat. I mean, yeah, I don't think it's good times for Mercedes at all, and even, with the rumours that the 2026 regs are going to be an engine-nominated formula, we know Mercedes, they nailed the last time that happened in 2014. If they can't sort out the car or understand the aero regs, then that won't matter. It'll be a case of being like 2014 Williams, where you've got a rocket down the straights, but you've not got the performance in the corners.
And Wolff was also asked a question, wasn't he, whether it's worth abandoning sort of all hope for 2025 and focusing purely on 2026 to nail those regulations, which is, I think, a fair question. It looks like this rule cycle's basically been and gone for Mercedes, and it's not really going to reward them with anything. But Wolff gave an interesting answer to that question, didn't he, when asked whether they were going to sort of switch focus from 2025 to 2026.
Yeah, so he was basically of the opinion that although 2026 represents the most realistic timeline that anyone can beat Red Bull, as a big automotive brand with a lot of sponsors, Mercedes can't afford to say publicly we're throwing in the towel. They've got to be defiant and say we will get on top of this. Whether it's whether you can believe they will or not is a different matter, but publicly Mercedes aren't a brand. They're not even a team like McLaren. I know McLaren have a lot of sponsors and investors, but they're more of an independent team that can kind of, they're not reliant on global image like Mercedes are. Mercedes are one of the biggest brands in the world. But yeah, I think from a performance standpoint and not that marketing standpoint, Mercedes can't afford to give up anyway, because if they're struggling with their simulation tools, that won't help them in 2026 because they'll just end up in the same predicament.
I take a bit of an issue with his answer, because I feel like if you put in too many eggs into your 2025 basket and then you fail at nailing the 2026 rules, then you're going to be in the same 4-year cycle that you're in now, because it's pretty clear that if you don't bake in a strong foundation at the start of a rule cycle, you're going to struggle for that rule cycle. And I feel like the Mercedes sort of marketing image and the investors and stuff like that will probably be hurt significantly more by another sustained period of like poor performances and poor results. Also, I feel like Mercedes as a brand, before Formula One, people bought Mercedes cars, and people will continue buying Mercedes cars. I don't think they're a brand that's somewhat in jeopardy in that regard. I almost don't even see them. I don't see too much correlation between the Formula One team and the automotive entity. I feel like they can operate and sort of sustain themselves on their own. But yeah, like you say with the simulation tools, yeah, they definitely need to get on top of that, because if they don't get on top of that, then they're screwed for whatever rule cycle gets thrown at them in 2026, and they could find themselves slipping even further back. I think it was very telling as well when you mentioned it. Obviously, Antonelli is probably being the one prepped for that seat. His first test is going to be in the 2021 car, not the 2022 car, because I think Toto Wolff said we want to get him used to what like a winning Formula One car, or like a good Formula One car, feels like, which I thought was an interesting statement to make. I'm not sure if it's even worth it. I think to understand the ground effect cars, just get him in a ground effect car, get him in the 2022 car. But
I mean, kind of just ending our conversation on Mercedes, obviously Toto still being, quite nice about Verstappen, not trying to get on the wrong side of him, because, as he said in Australia, he has mentioned that Verstappen's his number one target for that seat, and I think it's a case of Wolff will keep biding his time and waiting to see what develops with Verstappen. But as I put in an article the other week, Verstappen's tied down to 2028. There's no obligation for, you know how with like a contract, if someone's out of contract and in their speculation, you can quash that by the announcement of a new contract. Verstappen's already got a contract, so there's no kind of definitive point where it's like, look, Verstappen's staying. So it just seems like Wolff's being strung along until at some point he's got to then make a decision. And I think once that comes, it's kind of, he's waiting to see how the Verstappen situation develops. He seems to have calmed down with the whole, friction within Red Bull from Horner and Marco and whatnot. And then Mercedes will announce Antonelli in that seat, because it looks like Sainz might be considered elsewhere. And yeah, I think while Sainz's future and Perez's future will be decided in the coming months, I think it'll probably be near the end of the year, maybe the end of the European season, until we get an announcement from Mercedes. And I think it will be Antonelli in that car once it becomes crystal clear that Verstappen stay and put at Red Bull.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, he sort of backed himself into a corner with the driver market thing, because he's basically just putting all his eggs in this sort of Verstappen basket, which is very tenuous. I mean, these sort of things saying like, yeah, you said he's got a contract till 2028. So if there was a buyout clause in it, it'd be huge. I mean, I imagine Mercedes probably do have the finances to sort that out, but still. And also there's always these rumours of like, if Marco leaves, then Verstappen can leave. But like, nobody knows that to be true. I feel like something quite seismic is going to happen in this whole off-track Red Bull saga for Verstappen to genuinely consider leaving, because Mercedes just isn't a desirable destination for anyone. Same for Sainz. I think before the season started, it would be natural for Sainz to just go, oh, I'll go to Mercedes. But Mercedes have sort of driven their way out of contention for his signature, I feel, and for Alonso's. So that, yeah, they might as well just go with Antonelli, and sort of Antonelli can train himself up as a Formula One driver and waiting for when Mercedes, if they sort of sort themselves out again. I think, for the likes of Sainz, probably the most desirable seat, as we said before, is Aston Martin. But moving on from the Mercedes conversation, let's look at the mid to the backfield. It was a tale of two halves for Aston Martin. It was also a tale of two halves for RB once again. The F1 camera crew and producers were having a lot of fun of cutting away from Ricciardo to Liam Lawson every single chance they got. And they especially did that after the lap 1 incident where Ricciardo and Albon had their coming together on the entry to turn 3. Ricciardo being more concerned with what's going on his left and accidentally squeezing Albon on his right, and they both went into the barriers and ended their race. Meanwhile, Tsunoda, in front of his home fans, put on a very punchy display, making some nice moves in the S's on people to make sure that he secured the final points paying position in 10th. So Tsunoda, again, just looking very bouncing back from his Bahrain radio debacle and putting in some very solid performances and putting Ricciardo in a very tricky position. And also, I think RB are sort of kind of nailing themselves into that sort of best of the midfield bunch as well. Yeah, good for Tsunoda, not looking good for Daniel Ricciardo again.
Yeah, Tsunoda, I think Helmut Marko put it best after the race, and the biggest amount of praise you can put to him is that he's kind of delivered on that promise that he's always shown on a more consistent basis. Yes, he's being helped by an underperforming teammate, but he's also more consistent. He's not making the slight errors that he did before, and he's being rewarded with the plaudits he's getting at the moment. And at the moment, it looks kind of like a battle between RB and Haas to profit on any retirements, or most of the time Lance Stroll not performing up to the potentially Aston Martin. Tsunoda got it on this occasion. It looked at the start like Hulkenberg, might have displaced him, but then Hulkenberg didn't get the greatest launch on the second restart, and that kind of put his chances. RB executed a brilliant race. They've not always been the greatest team strategically or on the operations side, but it was their quick, slick work in the pit lane that got Tsunoda clear air. And on that gaggle of cars kind of fighting for that 10th place. And a really fine reward. And it's nice to see, a driver do well in front of their home fans. Tsunoda got his maiden point at Suzuka. And I don't think he'll be under consideration for this Red Bull seat. But he's definitely putting himself out there to kind of, in the same way that Pierre Gasly did when it was clear that he wasn't going to get promoted back to Red Bull. He then did enough at the sister team for Alpine to call on him once they had a free seat. So Tsunoda's going that right way. And at least if he doesn't move next year, he's doing what he can to retain his seat in case Liam Lawson comes in. The same can't be said for Daniel Ricciardo because his weekend ended in the barrier. I do agree with his point of view that obviously people are kind of looking at this crash and saying, that's kind of a continuation of his struggles. It's not, because it's a typical lap 1 incident that will happen a few times a season. If there's anyone to blame, it was Ricciardo, but Albon was in his blind spot on the approach to turn 3. I don't think you ever expect a car to be cut underneath you and go around the outside turn 3. And Albon even said it was kind of just unfortunate circumstances. It was the fact that Ricciardo was compromised through turn 1 and was on the medium tyre, whereas Albon, cut underneath, was on the soft tyre, had the grippier rubber to kind of, get that run, and he was lining up a move for the rest of the S's, not necessarily to turn 3. So it's just a really unfortunate incident that had big repercussions for both Ricciardo and also Williams, because that's another chassis that is now damaged and has been flown back to Grove to be repaired for the Chinese Grand Prix.
Yeah, it was another tricky weekend for Williams, wasn't it? I mean, Sargent had his off in first practice, but he sort of admitted he wasn't really sure of where he was positioning the car or something. It was an interesting excuse for just dipping it on the grass and chucking it into the barriers. But and then obviously Albon had that crash in the race. So as you said, they've got another chassis to repair. So it's just hard work for the mechanics at Williams at the moment. And then Sargent just didn't look to have the pace. The car just didn't look to have much pace. Haas again in the midfield. It was a sort of, they were fighting on the fringes of the points. So again, I think they didn't look to be anything like the team they were last year, which was good. Things again continuing to look pretty poor for Sauber and Alpine. We had a retirement gearbox issue for Zhou Guanyu. Bottas, despite having a very strong qualifying, things didn't really go well for him in the race. We didn't have any terrible pit stops this time, but they weren't exactly good. And then Alpine, it was just a bit of a disaster class from them. Their car's really not in a good shape, and Suzuka really did expose them. But behind the likes of RB and and Williams. How are you seeing the tail enders in Suzuka?
Yeah, I mean, Alpine, they brought some minor upgrades this weekend, some performance improvements, and to reduce the weight of their car. They weren't expecting miracles. Qualifying went okay. Ocon got through to Q2 for the second consecutive race, but then they just didn't have the pace in the race, and their woes were kind of compounded by when your luck's not in, and your two cars kind of having a minor touch even before turn one, because I think Gasly got a really good start on the restart, but so did Tsunoda, and it kind of ended up 3 wide, and the two Alpines touched. When your luck's not in, and that's epitomises Alpine at the moment. They finished, I think, like 20 plus seconds behind the next classified runner. So points were never really on the cards for Alpine. Haas, as I said, Hulkenberg could have got point. It was touching between him and Tsunoda, but I don't think Haas can be too upset. They weren't expecting much at Suzuka, and I think their race pace actually surprised them. So encouraging signs for them. I do think it's, as you said, RB and Haas as the top two in that like lower midfield battle. And then it's a case of Sauber, Alpine, and Williams. It's whoever gets off the mark first, but it's not looking promising for any of those three teams.
Not at all. But looking ahead, quickly, just to end our conversation, China's next up. Its first race since 2019. So it's its first race in this new era of regulations. And it's a sprint race, which I think a lot of people, in the drivers particularly, aren't too keen on, because it's a new circuit for these cars, and I think they want to have as much practice sessions as possible. But just quickly, your thoughts on F1's return to Shanghai.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it can't be worse than the last visit when they hyped up the 1000th Grand Prix, and it was a miserable race that had, other than lap one and Verstappen diving on Vettel, no action whatsoever. So yeah, it's always good when it kind of feels like that new venue vibe, because we've not been there for 5 years, not been there with the ground effect cars, so you don't really have a precedence to base what you think the pecking order is going to be, other than kind of the characteristics of the circuit and the asphalt and whatnot. I think McLaren will struggle with the long winding slow corners. That's their main weakness, and obviously like got the long back straight. Qualifying with DRS open, they might struggle there. I think Mercedes will also have a tough time. I think Ferrari should go quite well, but yeah, still expect Red Bull to be well on top, but yeah, who knows? Could have a bit of rain as well. China sometimes happens, but one practice session as well before the sprint weekend gets underway. So yeah, plenty of enigmas, and I think it will be one you can't necessarily predict below Red Bull. I think the teams that nail or have good correlation and simulation tools, so not Mercedes, will have a good weekend, and Ferrari have kind of nailed the sprint weekends last season. So yeah, let's see if they can capitalise on that to get closer to Red Bull.
Indeed. Let's see. We've got a fortnight to wait for that, so I think that's a good place to end. Before we return to Formula One, we'll also have Formula E having its inaugural Misano E Prix doubleheader, and MotoGP's back in action at Austin, Texas at the Circuit of the Americas. But for now, from me and Taylor, it's goodbye. Thank you to listening to this latest episode of Motorsport Speak. Make sure you like, review on all the podcast platforms that you subscribe to. Make sure you follow at Motorsport Week on X, formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and keep abreast of Motorsport Monday and motorsportweek.com. Thank you, and goodbye. No bada bing, bada boom this week.
No, I thought I'd keep it out.